how much is unknown when it comes to cannabis research, especially considering how long it's been,
Yeah.
a part of human culture.
Yeah, you're good.
It's really only been the last few decades where we've had the ability to even begin to tease apart
Right.
these different compounds.
Yeah, so for our listeners who maybe haven't spent their weekend reading cannabis studies,
Yeah.
what are we even talking about when we say entourage effect?
Well, I think a good place to start is actually with the name itself, because
Yeah.
even that has kind of a funny origin.
Yes.
So back in 1998, researchers were studying endocannabinoids.
Right.
These are molecules that our bodies naturally produce that are very similar
Yeah.
to cannabinoids found in the plant.
Okay.
And they were looking at how some molecules that are usually inactive on their own can actually boost the effects of endocannabinoids.
Interesting.
And it was during the
Yeah,
research that the term entourage effect kind of popped up.
So they're like, oh, these molecules are like an entourage.
Exactly. It was almost like this aha moment, like maybe this is happening with all the different compounds in cannabis itself,
Okay.
not just the endocannabinoids our body makes.
So it's not just about THC content or CBD content.
Exactly. We're talking about over 140 different cannabinoids, terpenes, flavonoids, all these things working together potentially.
Right. And you used the term chemovars earlier, and I thought that was interesting.
Yeah.
Because, most people listening are going to be familiar with the word strain.
Right.
But the research you sent over uses the term chemovar.
Yeah, it might seem like a small distinction, but I actually think it's really important because chemovar highlights the fact that every single cannabis plant has its own unique chemical fingerprint.
Right.
So you could have two plants that look and smell almost identical,
Okay.
but they could have completely different effects because of subtle variations in their chemical makeup.
So it's not enough to say this is an indica or this is a sativa.
Exactly. Those terms are more about the plant's physical characteristics, like how tall it grows or the shape of its leaves. But when we're talking about the entourage effect, we need to get way more specific, and that's why scientists prefer the term chemovar.
Chemovar, okay. I'm going to try to remember that one.
Yeah.
I also noticed in the research you sent that some researchers call cannabis a dirty drug, which honestly doesn't sound super appealing.
Yeah, that's true. It's not exactly the most flattering term,
Right.
but it's actually just a way that pharmacologists describe substances that interact with a lot of different targets in the body.
Okay.
Think of it like this. Most pharmaceutical drugs are designed to be very specific.
Right.
They're like a laser pointer targeting one specific thing in the body.
Right.
But cannabis is more like a light show. It interacts with a whole bunch of different systems,
Interesting.
which I think is part of what makes it so fascinating, but also so difficult to study.
Huh. So is that why people have such different experiences?
Exactly. You and I could try the exact same chemovar.
Right.
And have totally different reactions.
Makes sense.
And I think that's a big part of why the entourage effect is such a hot topic.
So we've got a lot to unpack here. We've got all these different compounds potentially interacting with each other. We've got this whole chemovar versus strain thing, and we're just starting to scratch the surface of how it all works.
Exactly. And the million-dollar question is,
Right.
is this just a clever marketing ploy, or is there really something to this entourage effect?
Okay, well, let's dig into that then. So some researchers are calling the entourage effect a game changer, while others are saying it's all hype. What makes this so hard to prove one way or the other?
Well, one of the things that makes it so tricky is that most people aren't consuming cannabis by putting a single isolated cannabinoid under their tongue.
Right, they're having the full experience however they choose to enjoy it.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting because in the lab, researchers often have to isolate compounds to figure out what they do individually.
But then you're missing the whole picture, aren't you?
Exactly. It's like trying to understand a symphony by only listening to each instrument separately.
Right, you're missing how it all comes together.
And it's not just about the cannabinoids either. We've got to talk about the terpenes.
Ah, yes, the terpenes. Those are responsible for the piney smell of some strains or the citrusy aroma of others. And there's research suggesting that terpenes might actually be doing a lot more than just smelling good.
It's true. Terpenes have a whole range of effects on their own, and some of them, like you said, might actually be influencing how our bodies interact with cannabinoids.
So it's not just like a background fragrance. It's actually playing a role in how we experience cannabis.
Exactly. There's research suggesting that certain terpenes might even increase the amount of CBD our bodies can absorb, which is huge.
So not only are we dealing with all these different cannabinoids interacting with each other, we're also adding terpenes into the mix, which could be like turning up the volume on some of these effects.
That's a good way to put it. It's a very complex picture, and it highlights why this research is so challenging, but also so important.
Okay, so let's say this entourage effect is the real deal. Paint me a picture. What does the future of cannabis look like if we can really harness this?
Well, imagine instead of just choosing a strain based on whether it's an indica or sativa, you're looking at a menu of options that are tailored to specific needs.
Okay, like personalized cannabis.
Exactly. Need help sleeping. There's a terpene profile for that. Dealing with inflammation might be a different terpene profile for that, too.
So instead of just grabbing whatever's on the top shelf, you could be getting something that's really tailored to your specific needs.
Exactly. That's the hope anyway. But of course, we need a lot more research before we get there.
Right. We need to figure out if this whole entourage effect is actually doing what some people say it's doing.
Exactly. Which brings us back to the research you sent over.
Okay, so after all this, what's the verdict? Does the entourage effect hold water, or is it just clever marketing? So where do we even land after all of that? Does the research come down definitively on one side or the other?
Well, it's not quite so cut and dry.
Okay.
There are definitely studies that show whole plant cannabis extracts can be more effective for certain things like pain and inflammation than just isolated THC or CBD.
Okay, interesting. So that's like a point for Team Entourage.
Right, but it's not always clear if those effects are because of some kind of synergistic entourage effect or just because different compounds are working on different pathways in the body.
Right, it's like taking a multivitamin versus taking each vitamin separately.
Exactly. You're still getting the benefits of all the vitamins, but they might not be interacting in some magical way.
But what about those studies on terpenes you sent over some of those? Seem to suggest that terpenes actually change how our bodies process cannabinoids.
You're right. That's definitely a big part of this whole discussion, and it has a lot of researchers really interested in the potential of terpenes.
Right, like maybe there's a terpene that makes CBD even more effective or something.
Exactly, and that could be a game changer for a lot of people, but we need more research to say for sure.
Okay, so more research is needed, but it's not all good news, right? I mean, there was that one article you sent that mentioned the possibility of a contra-entourage effect.
Yeah, that's right. And it kind of throws a wrench in the whole thing, doesn't it?
Right, because I'm thinking if some compounds can make each other work better, couldn't some compounds also cancel each other out or something?
It's definitely possible. Just because two things are good on their own doesn't mean they'll always play nice together.
Wow. So this is a lot more complicated than I thought.
Yeah, it really highlights how much we still don't know about cannabis and how these compounds interact.
So for someone listening to all of this who's like, okay, so what does this mean for me? What should I be looking for when I go to buy, whatever cannabis product I'm buying? What's the takeaway?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And unfortunately, there's no easy answer.
Okay.
Everyone responds differently to these different compounds, so it's really about finding what works best for you.
So there's no like one-size-fits-all answer?
Not yet, at least, but I think the research does point towards whole plant extracts potentially offering a wider range of benefits than just isolated compounds.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's like the difference between taking a multivitamin and just taking a vitamin C supplement.
Exactly, and paying attention to terpene profiles is huge too. It's not just about THC and CBD anymore.
Right, because different terpenes might have different effects, like some might be better for sleep, while others are better for focus.
Exactly, so it's really about doing your research, experimenting a bit, and finding what works best for you.
This has been incredibly interesting.
Yeah.
I have to say, when we started this whole deep dive, I was a bit skeptical, I'll admit, but seeing all the research you've gathered really opened my eyes to how much is still unknown about this plant.
It's a fascinating field, and it just goes to show that sometimes the most interesting discoveries are the ones we haven't even imagined yet.
I love that. And on that note, we'll leave everyone with this to think about. If traditional pharmaceuticals are all about isolating and purifying specific compounds, could that actually be a disadvantage when it comes to something like cannabis with all its complexity? Could we be missing out on the full potential of this plant by focusing so much on breaking it down?
It's definitely something to think about, and I have a feeling this is just the beginning of our understanding of the entourage effect and the incredible potential of cannabis.
Well said. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive. It's been a pleasure picking your brain.
Anytime. It's been a great conversation.